Hello.
Hello, we see some familiar faces. Nice to have you back online with us for the third cutting edge for this fall. I'm glad we're together again. Some of you I've seen outside of the virtual realm, so that was very nice part of this fall. It was very warm. And that's where we do start. We start with the land acknowledgement. I am on the land, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And McGill and I recognize these nations as the traditional custodians of the lands and the waters that we meet on to exchange, to learn, to share. And that's what I cherish about this traditional knowledge. I hope that when we get together like this, as we did when we were physically together on the land. So tonight, introducing Kyle, excuse me, is Frederic Guichard. I'll hand it over to Fred right now.
Thanks, Ingrid. And welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Kyle Elliot. Professor Elliot holds the Canada Research Chair in Arctic Ecology at McGill, and he joins the faculty at McGill in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences in 2015. Before he joined, he obtained his PhD in biology and conservation biology from the University of Manitoba. So he obtained his PhD in 2014, and he did a short postdoc at Guelph before joining McGill. Pretty straightforward and all nice, but you have to go back a little bit to find something a bit strange about Kyle's trajectory. Before he went into biology, he did his undergrad in math and physics, and he worked on particle accelerators, and he worked for Nortel. And just something happened, something switched, and he decided to do a new undergrad in biology. And that decision that happened at some point, and I don't know if it probably still affects his view on biology and the way he does science today, but that brought him from Nortel and particle accelerators to working on 5 continents. Very few people. I couldn't brag on my website that I'm working from the Amazon to the Arctic, in rainforests, deserts, oceans, and mountaintops. And then just for fun, adding that he checked 13 of the islands of the Canadian archipelago. So that's pretty amazing for a physicist. So Kyle, even if you joined McGill only in 2015, it still had time to publish way over 100 papers. Pretty impressive productivity, and he was named. He was on the list of 50 scientists from the World Economic Forum. So many recognitions. And before I hold the virtual floor to him, just saying that his research uses technology to follow birds and in the Arctic, and he uses really that information, collect that information, and use that information to assess the health of Arctic ecosystems. So that's the focus of his research. And with that, without further ado, I will invite Kyle to give his talk.
Okay, so this picture was taken by my PhD supervisor, actually, at Coates Island. And this kind of represents what I'm going to talk about today, because here he was at the colony and wondering what these birds did as they left the ice edge and came back, and all he could do was study them at the colony. They went out to sea, they disappeared for days, in fact, years on end, and there was no way to know what was happening out there at sea, under the water, deep, and or at the flow edge, in the Arctic winter. Now, with fancy gizmos, essentially, we can use these gizmos to follow birds deep underwater through the Arctic winter and find out a little bit about their lives. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So first off, I want to say that what I'm going to present today, it's not really my work. It's the work of a whole team of people. Here are the members of my lab. We're the lab with loggers. And so, we have a lot of fun doing all types of different things. And a few of the stories I'm going to tell you about today, really they're stories of graduate students in my lab. So where do birds go when they're not here? And I was just wondering if anybody wanted to, tell me where do the birds go? I mean, so we have a few that stick around winter at our feeders, but the rest of them, where do they go?
I think some of them go quite far away, like to South America.
Yeah, definitely. Some definitely go to South America. So we have, warblers coming through, vireos coming through. A red-eyed vireo that is in, in the trees over my house might end up in Venezuela. So definitely, some of them go much further. I mean, some even go down to the tips of Argentina. Other ones stay a little bit closer. But this, and why is it that we know this? Well, we know this first off because we can now travel huge distances, and we can go down and we can follow them down to South America, which wasn't really a possibility thousands of years ago. But also because we can now track them and find out exactly where they're going. So here's what Aristotle thought that birds were doing. So he conjectured that swallows and kites must hibernate, and here's a picture even from the 17th century, so relatively recently, of people harvesting swallows from the ground. He thought that they just went down in the mud and they hibernated under the mud. And we now know that that's certainly not true. His swallows and kites would have been going perhaps to Tanzania, Kenya. He also thought that birds transmutated, so that redstarts became robins and garden warblers became blackcaps, that they just changed. All of a sudden, the birds which were here changed their plumage and became a different species of bird simply by sometime in the fall. And of course, again, we know that's not true. In fact, the redstarts and garden warblers go a little further south to the other side of the Mediterranean, whereas the robins and blackcaps move in from further north. And not only can we find out about kind of the common birds around our houses, around our homes, but we can follow birds to see some of the incredible trajectories that they can do. So we can follow bar-headed geese migrating across the Himalayas. There's records of bar-headed geese flying up to 7,000 meters over Mount Everest, and we can track them doing that. We can track emperor penguins, the deepest diving bird, down to almost 1,000 meters in depth, and monitor their heart rate and find out that their heart rate goes much lower than anything that we could ever withstand. We can follow Arctic terns as they migrate from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back again in an endless summer. And then one of my favorite examples here is ancient murrelet, which doesn't do a north-south migration, but actually does an east-west migration that we knew absolutely nothing about until we put trackers on these birds. So they, by putting geolocators, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, on these birds, we're able to track them from the coast of BC, where they breed, and they go all the way across the Pacific, thousands of kilometers, to winter off of Japan. Indeed, we could say that we're living in this golden age of biologging. We're finding out where every animal is going. We're able to follow them around the globe. And here's this example of Arctic animals, which were tracked in a paper that came out this week. And you can see that with the exception perhaps of northern Russia, clearly we have to work a little more with our colleagues in Russia, but that there's incredible that there are thousands and thousands of locations. So each of these red dots represents a location from a bird or mammal that's being tracked, and go online and see where muskox are going, where caribou are going, where trumpeter swans are moving to. So we can now track animals in almost real time and find out where they're moving and where they're going. And we're really living through a golden age of this, where we're tracking the species which we never thought would be possible, and finding out where they're going and following them year round. So and what's driving this? Well, really it is it's this gig economy, right? It's the revolution in microelectronics, which is allowing us to be able to do this. I was just wondering, I don't have a poll, but I was just wondering if I kind of could have a hand up of how many people are own a smartphone. You could just put your little hand up in the chat or react in some way. So I mean, it's It's not as many as I thought, but maybe not quite as many of you are listening as. But of those of you which are able to put your hand up, I think everybody but one of us has a smartphone. So I certainly do, and despite resisting it for many years. And so you can see here, in terms of the text messages, sent in Canada, you can see the change over time as well between kind of 2006 and 2012, which is when this change really happened. And now the prevalence of smartphones in Canada is incredible. I mean, it's over 80% of Canadians now of adult Canadians have a smartphone. So this consumer pressure has really revolutionized our own society, but it's also changed how we can study wildlife. So it's fundamentally changing how we can study wildlife. Here are a few different types of devices that we put on birds. And so we put on geolocators, little tiny devices which go on the legs, which you can see in the top left there. So little tiny devices you can barely see. We put on GPS loggers, which are quite a bit larger, and you can see one on the back of a kittiwake here. You can see that it's a substantial package. We have an accelerometer in the bottom left, which you can see on the back of this thick-billed murre. And we have a time depth recorder that you can see in the bottom right. And I'm just going to go through a few examples of what we can find out from each of these. So the first example here is solar geolocation. So this here is just a little lightly logger that you can see out of the back of this thrush, and you can see this. So as you can see, this thrush is got a little light stalk out the tip, and so it's recording light levels. And we can use light levels to determine day length. So day length tells us something about latitude. Not very well around the equinox, but the rest of the year, if it's a long day in the summer, then it must be at a relatively high latitude. And then the timing of dawn and dusk can tell us about longitude. So it can tell us kind of if dusk, so dusk has just happened here in Montreal. So we know based on the timing of dusk, approximately where it is in terms of longitude. And you can see on the bottom here how that works in terms of having light intensity and how that varies. So we can use that to determine approximately where this thrush is. And it's accurate to about 200 kilometers. So it's not very accurate, but it gives us a rough idea of where the bird might be. And so it's used on animals with large migrations, such as fish and birds. Here's an excellent example of someone studying blackpoll warbler migration. And so blackpoll warblers are little tiny songbirds that migrate through from the boreal forest down to South America. As Ingrid had mentioned, it's one of those species which goes all the way down to Venezuela. And you can see here actually the wintering locations, which we never knew before this. You can see that there's some populations wintering in Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, Guianas. And the thing that's really amazing to me is that you have this little tiny songbird, which doubles in mass. So it doubles its weight in just a few days, and then takes off of the coast of North America, as you can see, and then flies across the Atlantic to land in South America. So, I mean, it's just an incredible migration that we wouldn't have known about without the use of these geolocators. So again, they give us a very coarse idea of where the animal is, but if they're moving over such large distances, as you can see here, we can get an idea of where they're moving. Another example is with radio telemetry. So we can use a radio transmitter, and we can put a radio transmitter on the back of the bird. The nice thing about a radio transmitter is it's relatively small. I brought one along with me here. So this is one of the Modus transmitters. And so I have here my white-throated sparrow, which unfortunately died at an animal rehabilitation center. And we can put onto its back here, we can put a round, so we have a radio transmitter. You can see how small this radio transmitter is. Right there it is. It's going to focus, but you can see it's really, really small. And we can put that around on the back of the sparrow, and you can see how small it is relative to the sparrow. It's got two sets of loops, which we'd put around the legs, and it could carry this on its migration and for the rest of the year. We could find out a little bit about where it's going. And so we can use radio telemetry, and we need to have enough information to be able to triangulate a location, or at least get presence or absence, which can be time intensive. The other possibility, and what's being increasingly used, is to use an automated radio array. So the cost per tag is relatively low. It only costs about $200 for one of these tags that I just showed you, but the money and effort is needed to maintain this array. and there's a need for a high density of receivers to be able to triangulate because there can be lots of interference. And here you can see there's actually a radio transmitter put on a person, and they walk the trails around Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama. And you can see that they were able to triangulate pretty much the path of this person just based on the signals from this radio array. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the accuracy was very, very high. We can then apply that to a wildlife, such as this gray-cheeked thrush. And you can see that this thrush, it migrates again from South America up to the boreal forests of Canada, just like that black-poll warbler. And there's a whole bunch of radio receiver stations which have been placed all around North America. And this is called the MODIS Wildlife Array. And so anytime it passes by one of these stations, it gets detected. And so these tags were placed on the gray-cheeked thrush in Colombia. And they then migrated up to the boreal forest during their spring migration. And they were detected at various places along the way. And you can see that one of those little tags, down in the bottom left of this figure, which is identical to the tag which I just showed you. And you can see that the higher on the right-hand side, the higher the departure fuel load, the further it was able to migrate, right? So it had to stop less frequently, the higher the fuel load. If we want to then move up a little bit more in size, we can then move up to a GPS logger. And that's something like this here. And so I can show you here, it's a little bit bigger. If I can compare the two in size here. This here is that radio tag, and this is a GPS logger. So this is one of the smallest GPS loggers on the market, suitable for a marine bird. And you can see that, so it's a little bigger than a radio tag. I mean, it's substantially bigger than a radio tag, but we get GPS level precision. So GPS works via timestamp, and the difference in timestamp between the satellite and the receiver gives distance. So it allows us to triangulate a location if you have at least 3 satellites. But in fact, you have to actually account for curvature of space-time. And this was kind of one of those epiphanies. Again, Frederick had mentioned of my kind of physics background. I thought I'd never again have to learn about general relativity, but to actually figure out the location of a GPS, you have to actually solve Einstein's equations. So in fact, that's one of the few applications I think of general relativity. So here I am using general relativity again as a biologist. And here's a really cool example, I think, of what we found out from GPS loggers. And this is the case of a Gyrfalcon. So Gyrfalcons are Arctic falcons. And it was thought that they would come down and so they breed up in Arctic areas, and then they come down on Arctic cliffs, and then they spend the winter in open areas in the south, or perhaps in tundra habitats. But what we found out is that they're in fact seabirds. So they spend an awful lot of time out on the sea ice, and you can see some examples here of Gyrfalcons which spent much of the winter out on the sea ice hunting seabirds and other, potentially, other things living out on the sea ice. And so the authors of this paper call them the secret seabirds. So again, it just kind of revolutionized what we know about this species. So one of the things I'm going to, I have to emphasize, and you can probably figure that already from the size of the loggers I just showed you, that the main limitation is the size of the logger that you can put on an animal. So this is a little bit old now. This is only about 5 years old, this graph, but still it's, things are moving so quickly that in fact, we're actually able to move this a little bit further to the left. But if you were to use a cellular GPS, so one that downloads to the cell network, and that's about 27 grams. Obviously that's great because, you don't have to pay satellite fees. A satellite GPS is about 22 grams. A satellite Doppler, so this isn't GPS level precision, this is more like a kilometer precision, is about 5 grams. A GPS data logger, like the one I just showed you, 2.5 grams. But you can see that most birds, you can't even monitor them with a logger that's 2.5 grams. Most birds are actually too small to be able to be tracked using that type of equipment. So so then you can move to a geolocator, like we mentioned, for the black-poll warbler. And but even there's many species which aren't which you can't track that way. Okay. Okay, so that's a little bit about how we can know where animals are, but how can we know about what they're doing when they're there? So we can use accelerometers. So another thing which we can couple with the GPS is to couple an accelerometer with the GPS. And so here's an accelerometer placed on the back of a penguin, and it measures acceleration in 3 different axes. So it has a surging axis, a heaving axis, and a swaying axis. And based on the variation in those axes, we can then determine the behavior of this penguin. So when it's lying on land, we can see that the heaving axis measures about 10 meters per second squared, which is 1 G, right? So when it's lying on ground, the heaving axis is upwards, and so we have a measurement of 1 G upwards, whereas the surging acceleration is relatively close to 0. When it moves to stand up, we get the opposite. We get the surging acceleration all of a sudden going to 1 G, and the heaving acceleration going down, right? Because the angle of the logger has switched. So we can determine whether or not the penguin is heaving or is standing or lying just based on those 2 axes. We can also figure out, if you go to C, then you can see when it's walking. So you can see the movement from the accelerometer. We can see when they're tobogganing and when it goes back to walking. At the same time, we can see the when the bird dives, and you can see there that that you can see the switch from a negative G to a positive G as the bird dives descends and the bird ascends, and you can also see when the bird is porpoising on the right hand side, and so again you have this distinctive acceleration signal. And this is exactly the same way that your smartphone figures out what you're doing. If you're walking or biking or skiing, your smartphone can figure that out. And the way it does that is exactly using accelerometer that is inside of any smartphone. And so you can also determine the body angle. I kind of alluded to that based on the standing versus lying down. You can actually calculate exactly what is the body angle with a little bit of trigonometry, like they've done here with this penguin. It allows us to figure out exactly the rate at which this king penguin ascends, and we were able to use this information to be able to figure out that actually they reduce body angle as they come towards the surface to reduce the risk of decompression sickness and the bends. So a little bit of math here that isn't really that important, but the thing that the point that I'm trying to make here is that energy expenditure, and if you remember back to your high school physics, that's related to work and is related to mass times velocity times the integral of acceleration times time. That's not all that important, other than to say that we can integrate acceleration over time to get an estimate of energy expenditure. So here we have some data I simulated for an accelerometer, and you can see on the X, Y, and Z axis, and you can see here that there are periods of what we call high dynamic body acceleration and low dynamic body acceleration. So times when the animal's being very active and times when it's not being so active. And in fact, if we use this dynamic body acceleration, you can see that it correlates very well with daily energy expenditure measured in other using doubly labeled water, so as kind of a gold standard. So we can see that if we use the accelerometer, this dynamic body acceleration from the accelerometer, it actually correlates very well with externally measured daily energy expenditure. So in other words, we can use these accelerometers as Fitbits for these birds and measure energy expenditure in a wild animal, which is really neat because up to this point, it was very challenging to do this in any other way. We can also use accelerometers to record prey intake. Here I have a bird with so this is a thick-billed murre with a video camera on its back, and we also it also has an accelerometer. And so the bird is descending here, and you know, so it's working very hard to descend, and you can see that from the accelerometer profile at the top. And as it descends, you know, it's working really, really hard. So it's accelerometer at the top, and you can see the depth as the lower figure. And now it's near the bottom, and it's going to come up towards the top as it ascends. And it's going to catch prey amphipods as it moves up towards the top. And you can see every time that it catches a prey, there's a little wiggle in terms of the accelerometer signal. Okay. And so it's a little bit like our own little video game. And this is what happens when you ask a grad student to watch hundreds of hours of video. So how can we measure energy intake in this way? Well, so here we have this the same bird with depth, the depth profile. You can see the swaying acceleration measured in you know, in the first step. We can then compute the variance, and we can see peaks in the variance. And finally, we can smooth those. We can see each time the bird consumed a prey, or at least chased after a prey, and we can compare that to the video observations. And you can see that with a couple of exceptions, it does a very good job of measuring when these birds capture their prey. Okay, and then so here's an example of where we're trying to combine the accelerometer with the GPS. And so we're combining sensors. And so this was a neat paper. You know, I thought it was really interesting, working on cougars. And part of what I thought was really interesting is that they're working in suburban areas in California. So you can see this is basically in people's backyards. And in the left-hand side, you can see a cougar with a GPS collar with an accelerometer in it. And you can see that at 2:01 a.m., it moved into the area, kind of moved into the suburban area, and walked along, and eventually it killed a deer and consumed it at 4:01 a.m., and then by 8 a.m. it's left the area. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there's this dynamic body acceleration and VO2, so metabolic rate, right? VO2 is what you measure when you're, you know, when you're exercising. It's what you're, you know, what the output on the treadmill, and you can see that there's a good correlation. So you can see that we could use this to measure the energy costs for this cougar. You can see in the yellow, you can see the high speed travel, so where it's moving quickly, it's running, then a slow walk, and finally the pounce and buck as it captures the prey, eating for several hours, and then it leaves, right? And so we're able to combine the GPS and the accelerometer to understand what this puma is doing. And on the bottom right-hand side in the C, you can see that the prey mass consumed correlates very well with the energetic cost of the pounce and kill. So they invest more in prey that they gain more from. Another great example, I mentioned this at the start here, was bar-headed geese. So these are bar-headed geese flying over the Himalayas. And the interesting thing about these geese is that they actually use this roller coaster flight to minimize their time at altitude. So you can see here, this is, this measure using accelerometer to measure energy expenditure, but also heart rate. And you can see that heart rate increases very rapidly with altitude. In other words, it's very expensive to go high up because the air is much thinner, and so it's much more expensive to fly. And so rather than going across this blue line, which would be kind of a gradual ascent from 3,000 meters up over 4,000 meters up over the passes of the Himalayas, instead they use this roller coaster approach of going up and down, up and down, up and down, and trying to spend as much time at low altitude because it's much less expensive to fly there. So a couple of great examples of like how you can combine GPS and accelerometers to understand animal movement. Okay, so what is really driving these trends? I'll give you an example of several different sensors, and what is it? What is the pressure that's really really making us able to use these fantastic technology? Well, it's the I want to convince you here that this is really the technology in your smartphone that's driving this. It's consumer electronics. And here you can see Moore's law, which is famous. It's kind of the doubling size of number of transistors per centimeter. So the memory of a computer going from a 4040 up to a Pentium to an i7 and beyond. And this has continued up to 2020. And you can see the slope of this is actually the same as what I'm going to call Moore's law. So Moore was that small seabird that we were studying. And you can see that actually the slope is very, very similar. So basically the amount of memory in one of these devices follows very closely the trend in consumer electronics. And we can make the calculation then that by 2060, we'll have a 1 gram logger that takes 1 megabyte photos every second for a year. And you can just take off one of those pixels if you want depth and another 3 pixels if you want acceleration. At the same time, the recorders have gotten smaller and smaller. Here you can see on the bottom, you can see the example of the GPS is getting smaller and smaller over time. And in fact, that even that smallest GPS, which was from 2009, is way smaller than what I have here. And you can see that basically there's a halving time of about 5.5 years. So between 1980 and 2010, about every 5.5 years, the size of the device halved. And so we can calculate that by 2060, we'll have a time depth recorder recording every second for a year, will weigh 2 milligrams. And so, so it'll be this little tiny piece of dust. So really, I think there's a great future for tracking wildlife. However, for now, we still have some quite large devices. And so I just want to stop for a second. I've told you kind of how great these loggers are. I just want to stop for a moment to think about how some of the drawbacks of using loggers on wild animals. So we need to understand the effects of biologging. So the classic animal welfare approach is to use the 3 R's, which is to reduce, refine, and replace. And indeed, the average logger size on a large bird is now 1/3 of what it was in 1985. And I have this cute little cartoon here, and I'll let you you read that if you like. And so this is exactly what we want to try and avoid with sharks. This is biologgers gone wrong, right? And we have 2 different rules. We have the 5% rule and we have the 3% rule. And this is now the most cited rule is the 3% rule, which is very different. I mean, this camera, which was attached on this pigeon to be able to spy over enemy lines in World War I, this wouldn't be allowed by animal, or at least for scientific experimentation, would no longer be allowed, right? So we have to keep things under 3% of body size. But I want to argue here that, in fact, 3% is actually perhaps too big. So here is a recent study we had on rhinoceros auklets. And you can see here, so we were studying the tagging and handling effects on breeding success of rhinoceros auklets during early incubation, late incubation, and early chick rearing. And we had controlled, handled, and GPS-equipped birds. And you can see that the GPS-equipped birds abandoned much more readily than the handled or controlled control individuals, but that the effects for handling and control were much later on in chick rearing. Nonetheless, we still had 60% abandoning in terms of, in response to having a GPS on their back. So really, we need to consider device effects. And here's a similar meta-analysis from a whole bunch of different bird species. And you can see that in this case, in some cases, they would report an effect on the chick or sometimes an effect on the adult, but in every case, there was some type of effect of the device on wild birds. So it was really important to take this into consideration. In some cases, the effect would, and for us, it varied with the age of the bird as well. So the effect on the young bird, they passed most of the cost onto their chick because they could breed many more times, whereas the adult took most of the costs on themselves. So this is just to emphasize that across a whole bunch of different species, these tagging effects are really, really important. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus a little bit on my own research. I realize I don't have too much time left, so I want to kind of wrap up with a few examples from my own work. And we tried to use small devices on experienced birds of known history, but in some case, probably still had an effect. So, how do I use tagging biologgers in my own research? Well, part of it's to try and understand how marine ecosystems influence behavior. In 2014, the Blob appeared off the North Pacific. This is the largest marine heat wave in history. And so we had a whole bunch of hot water off of the Pacific coast of North America. And so we want to know what impact this would have on the ecosystem, particularly on seabirds. And one of the things we found was that pre-heat wave, most of the birds were feeding very close to the colony. During the heat wave, they expanded out and foraged much further away from the colony. And this was sustained actually 2 years after the heat wave. The birds were still foraging much further away. So it seems this heat wave had a lasting impact on these seabirds. And we think that the lag time for this might be about 2 years because many of the fish that they're feeding on are about 2 years of age. Another example of kind of a disturbance, a global disturbance, is loss of Arctic sea ice. So this is September 1984 versus September 2016, and we've just heard that 2020 is in fact has an even lower ice extent than 2016. And so I was wondering if anybody could kind of guess how much Arctic sea ice we've lost in the last 20 years since satellites began in 1979. How many millions of square kilometers? Any guesses here in the chat?
I think something like 5 to 7 million square kilometers. Lawrence here speaking.
So I don't have it quite that high. I think that's the final extent, but I think it's down to about 3. We've lost about 3 million square kilometers is the number I was able to come up with. But good guess. It's an awful lot. I mean, it just boggles the mind, right? We hear a lot about climate change, and I think this really makes it very tangible. And we've seen the impact of this in terms of the diet of the birds I'm working on. So we've seen the ecosystem switch from an Arctic to Atlantic ecosystem in the summer in Hudson Bay. So they switched from feeding on Arctic cod and Arctic ice-associated fish to feeding on capelin, which is a North Atlantic fish. And we can see that there's impacts here in terms of the energetics. And so the accelerometers measured an energetic impact of this. So not only are they switching, when they switch their diet, they're not only getting less nutritious fish for their offspring, but they're also working a lot harder. So the adults are also being impacted. We've also used geolocators to actually record where they go in winter as well, and to be able to watch them as they move where they go in winter, and they closely follow the ice path. And here's an estimate over time in terms of where they're currently. They leave Coates Island, they leave Hudson Bay, they go out through Hudson Strait, and they spend much of the winter off of Greenland in the North Atlantic. And but we expect that in future, because of reduced ice, they'll start wintering further and further north, and they might not even have to leave Hudson Bay. So here's an example of how we can use geolocators to figure out where they go and to try and understand what habitats they're using and where they might occur in the future. They're also encountering more and more competitors, and so something like razorbills, which are moving in as well. And so they're one of the things which might cause them to be distributed further and further north is potential competitors such as this razorbill. So I'm going to wrap up just by telling us what behavior can also tell us about the marine ecosystem. And so we've just heard about how the changes in the marine ecosystem can tell us about it can affect seabird behavior. Now we're trying to see what behavior can tell us about marine ecosystems. In other words, what happens here in Montreal in terms of the pollutants that we release or the greenhouse gases that we release, we can detect here. And this is my field camp up in the Arctic. And the idea here is that rather than using an icebreaker, which can cost $150,000 a day and gives us only one track, we can use seabirds, which are essentially volunteers, and spread out over a 300-kilometer foraging radius. They also dive exceptionally deep, 150 meters for nearly 5 minutes, and I challenge any of you to try and hold your breath for 5 minutes while dashing 150 meters there and back. They have the highest wing loading of any bird. In other words, they have small wings and a big body, which means that they have the highest flight costs recorded. In fact, they have the highest sustained cost of any animal. Basically, they have to have the energy output of Usain Bolt, but do that for a marathon. Now, why is this important? Well, I couldn't put the most recent president on here, so I had to put the previous president, who assigned, so Obama and Trudeau signed an agreement to protect much of the Arctic. In fact, protect about 10% of the Arctic waters, and so we need to know where key areas are to protect in the north. And here are some publications on thick-billed murres. So in other words, we know an awful lot about seabirds, but we know very little about other things in the Arctic. Here's everything I could find about some of these Arctic fish. So we know very little about Arctic fish. And so I thought, well, why don't we use the seabirds to learn a little bit more about Arctic fish? And here's some examples. So here's a bird, here's its depth. So it dove down, and we can see here it came back to the colony with an Arctic poacher. So we know that it caught that poacher at a relatively deep depth. And so we can figure out perhaps where that Atlantic poacher lives, whereas the sandlands, it caught much closer to the surface. Tells us a little bit about where sandlands are. Do the same with the Arctic cod. We thought that Arctic cod lived in among ice, but actually it seems like they're benthic during the ice-free period. So we learned something absolutely new about this Arctic cod. It turns out that they require very little bottom time to capture Arctic cod, and we think that that's because when there's Arctic cod around, they're just super abundant. Here's an example of an Arctic cod school, and to give you an idea of scale, those are beluga whales, which are next to the cod school. And so then we can map out where they caught these different prey items, and so we can do this for different prey species. And we can find out that there's a hot spot about 30 kilometers west of the colony, and that might be an important area to protect. And in fact, in the latest report I saw from Fisheries and Ocean Canada, in fact, they are developing a marine protected area for this region. And here's for some other species as well. So in other words, we can track seabirds and use that to track prey spatial distribution, which can be useful to create marine reserves and also to understand marine pollution, although I didn't go into that in much detail. So biologging devices are rapidly advancing. These devices can impact wildlife, but there are several principles that can minimize impact. Biologgers can tell us how the environment impacts animal behavior, and animal behavior, when tracked, can tell us about the marine environment. So I just wanted to thank all these people and the funders that have supported this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyle. Really great talk. Thanks a lot. We do have time for some questions, and there were some questions from the audience that I'm going to read to you. First, about the for the migration, these long-term migrations. The question asking, so how much do wind currents help some of these long migrations by birds? So you've addressed some of that in your talk, but in general, we have an idea.
Yeah, wind currents are thought to be really important. I mean, they are certainly very important, both for seabirds and for migratory land birds. We know that, for instance, sandpipers, when they're migrating down to South America, they get up into the jet stream, and they use currents these wind currents to move along, and they wouldn't be able to make it all the way there if they didn't have the support of these winds. Likewise, there's the kittiwakes, which I study in the North Atlantic, their migration route carefully follows the wind currents there in the North Atlantic. So they're presumably using these currents to be able to move themselves around much more efficiently than they would otherwise. And so this also gets us concerned in terms of climate change if some of these winds change.
They will be constrained by those winds. And so you could predict, you could use that to predict trends in migration path over the years, right?
Yeah, exactly. So to try and, if the Gulf Stream changes and this has changes in wind patterns, then we could, expect that birds would either react or perhaps not do very well.
Yeah, it's cool. So, and I think you're recruiting tonight. So there's a question here about how many graduate students you work with, and if they all work together on separate projects.
Yeah. Well, there. I think I saw some of my graduate students in the, watching tonight. So I better be careful what I say, right? Yeah. No, I'm very fortunate, and that so I have 10 graduate students at the moment, and they certainly work very well together. And I'm very fortunate that they work together so well as a team. And that, in fact, I get to just sit back and see all the amazing things that they do, and then present it to people like yourselves and pretend it's my own work. But and so some of them are doing their own work. I mean, I have a student which is working on purple martins, and she's been able to work through the pandemic, which we were very fortunate for. So it was nice and local, and she actually was able to retrieve some GPSs of purple martins this year. It's gone all the way down to the Amazon. In fact, some of the parts of the Amazon which are on fire this fall was exactly the area where these birds were. So some of them are working kind of on their own projects like that, and then other ones are working on at Middleton Island or Coates Island on kind of team projects.
Pretty cool. Yeah. Okay, good. There was one clarifying question about what the meaning of wind loading. If you can explain.
Oh, yeah. So I went through that very quickly. I felt I was running out of time, so I started moving a little quick at the end, didn't I? Wing loading is the mass divided by wing area. So you can imagine that something like a thick-billed murre has a big body mass with little tiny wings, so it has a very high wing loading. It's something like a stealth fighter jet. And so that means that its energy costs are really, really high. It needs a lot of fuel, but it also flies really fast and gets where it's going really quickly. On the other hand, something like a frigate bird has a very low wing loading, and so or an albatross, it has a very low body mass and huge wings, and so its flight costs are very, very low, but it can't get anywhere very fast.
Yeah. Thanks. And I was also worried about the poor suckers who are not moving when you have all these migratory birds who are traveling across the world, and you're tracking them, you're following them. It's all great. But we've always thought of ecosystem of communities as pretty well integrated networks of interactions of predators and their prey. And then, there you go. You have all these species that are leaving for months and leaving the rest of the community behind. So how does the information you collect on migratory species inform the response, how the rest of the community deals with that, losing their neighbors and their network?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a couple of things there. I mean, first off, so certainly, most of the species which are leaving in terms of birds are insectivorous birds. So there's no insects, or very few insects here. Certainly aerial insects here in the wintertime. So we lose that entire part of the community, right?
Yeah.
And so presumably some of the granivorous birds also move a little further south, and that must be somewhat of a benefit to the local species because all of a sudden it has a niche that they can open up. But presumably they're leaving because the abundance here isn't that great.
Mm-hmm.
So resident species typically they have a higher reproductive success, but they have relatively low survival here. So that overwinter mortality is very high in Quebec in the boreal forest, whereas these migratory species or tropical species often have lower reproductive success, but they have higher survival because they can go down to better areas. Of course, when they arrive in the tropics, there are already birds there, and so those birds have to be able to deal with this influx of northerners that arrive.
Yeah. So I guess but that's a challenge for studying this, right? Because you still need to be on the ground studying the resident, the host ecosystems that are seeing some species leave and arrive.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it's certainly very challenging to be able to follow birds year round. And so migratory species are just very difficult to study, especially ones which are going to places like the Amazon or the deep seas or the Arctic winter, where it's just very difficult to follow them. So we can get only so much from the biologgers.
Yeah. That's so if someone has another question, you can unmute yourself if you want to talk. That would be good.
Lawrence here. I'll ask a question.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
Yes. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. I guess a fundamental question I have is, how do you decide which birds to study, or are there any birds that you haven't studied or you aren't able to study?
Yeah. Well, yeah, certainly. Birds that we can capture and put these loggers on, I mean, so that are big enough, are of course ones which are targeted. So there's been a lot of work on seabirds and raptors because they're big enough to be able to track, and and also things like seabirds, which are at colonies and so relatively easy to recapture. So many of these loggers, you have to be able to recapture the bird, which can be a real challenge. We tried working on bellbirds in Costa Rica, and it didn't go so well. We were really interested because they're altitudinal migrants, and so they go down the slope. So they go from the cloud forest down the Caribbean slope, over the Pacific slope, and back up, we think. But nobody ever put a GPS on them. So we tried working on them, but they were just trying to capture these birds way up in the canopy of the cloud forest. We just had very little success. So part of it is just what we're able to work on.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I have a
Fred, I think we should really officially thank and ask everyone to put their video on so that they can actually show Kyle that they've been listening, and give him a round of applause so that he can see our appreciation visually. And I do have the pleasure of officially giving him the gift. We always give our speakers a gift. It's usually this book. It's called The Fossil's Tale. It is all the things in the Dawson Gallery. They tend to be fossiliferous, but for Kyle, I've marked this spot with a Post-it because there is a whole section on the origin of birds. So there is something that I think even Dr. Elliot will be able to get out of this book, and I'll mail it to him. So thanks again officially from the Cutting Edge Committee. Thank you to our student volunteers, Alex Byrne, the technician, Stuart McCombie. And I do want to let you know the one in about a month, our Cutting Edge in a month from now, is on December 10th. That is by Dr. Christopher Moraes. He is with the Advanced Cellular Microenvironments Department. He's a chemical engineer. This is a little bit of a first for the Cutting Edge. Usually we have lots of biologists and ecologists. Michael Mackey will introduce Christopher Moraes. We're looking forward to that next month. You do have to pre-register for these Cutting Edge, for the Freaky Fridays, for all of these series. Very easy to find online. Google Cutting Edge, Red Path Museum, and you will find the web form to register.